And of course the heavyweight B-52 bombing has a role in this, as does the smaller strike aircraft, but also the attack helicopters. And this is actually quite crucial, because these are the machines getting quite close on the ground. They have a tremendous information gathering capacity and a tremendous target engagement capacity. And this 30mm gun under the nose, the operator has a helmet with sensors on it, and where he just has to look at a target, he's got a little crosshair, and just press a button and the gun follows and takes that out. So
that's incredible.
It is. In fact, if you talk to the operators, they say it's rather spooky when they're on exercise. They just look at something, press a button, and the thing they're looking at just disappears. But that, the helicopter capability and effect is vulnerable to the weather. The B-52s and the other strike aircraft can fly quite high above the storm, and they can drop a precision-guided bomb through it, and that won't really be affected. But
presumably this is also very, very difficult, because whilst you want to take out the Republican Guard, you've still got to be so careful to avoid civilian casualties.
Oh, you have, and this is very much the way we operate in the West these days, and with the precision abilities we have, we can to some extent ensure that. But when you get into street fighting, then the picture changes completely, and at this point we have tied our own hand behind our backs, because what happens is we can expect the Fadain and elements of the Republican Guard to fight in civilian clothing, as Air Marshal Mason just said, and also to deliberately mingle in with the civilian population to draw fire onto them. And there has not been a street war in history which has not involved heavy civilian casualties. The other side of it, the report just now mentioned tanks, and the fact that in the open the T-72s can't be a match for our tanks. Well, there's a bit of a problem here, because the tanks in some sense become your mobile artillery, so they need to have high explosive shells, but they also need to be on the lookout for these T-72s hiding around corners, and to deal with those they have to have armor-piercing shells, which behave in a totally different way. So and the tank only has a limited ammunition capacity. It's very cramped in there. And an armor-piercing shell, let's say you want to take out a building, won't really take the building out. It'll make a small hole in one wall on the way in and a small hole in the other wall on the way out. So there is this fine line between what you do with your armor. Then, of course, there's the problem of snipers. And in Stalingrad, the biggest street battle of the Second World War, to some extent there was a sniper war. They were a real problem for both sides.
And these all areas that we really want to avoid, hence the heavy bombing of Baghdad. Absolutely. At the moment. Well, let's take a look now. I believe we've got we had some very, very heavy attacks on Baghdad overnight. I think this is some of the heavier explosions that we heard overnight. We know that one of the main airstrikes last night, aiming to hit Iraqi television and a key telecommunications site and Baghdad satellite communications. Why is it so crucial to take out the television in Baghdad?
Well, if you recall, during the Kosovo War, there were attacks on television centres in Belgrade, which attracted some criticism because, of course, that necessarily results in civilian deaths. But the idea was that this is a means by which the regime communicates with its population, and therefore was something we wish to take out. Now, there were suggestions yesterday that following Saddam's rather confident speech in the morning, that was a factor we wished to remove from the conflict. And so if we are attacking television centres, then it will be as a response to Saddam's re-emergence, as it were, and to stop him rallying his people to the cause.
Michael McGinty, thank you very much. Well, the US cavalry are pushing towards Baghdad after crossing the Euphrates River. They're encountering little resistance, but are travelling through a thick dust storm. CNN's Walter Rogers is embedded with the 3rd Squadron 7th Cavalry and is with the troops as they push northwards.
The unit crossed the bridge, literally fighting its way to the bridge last night and then crossing this morning following an advanced unit that is Bone Crusher Troop. how they got there. They were shooting much of the way well into the night and were able finally to cross, but there was substantial Iraqi resistance. The significance of crossing the Euphrates River for the 7th Cavalry is that it now means that you have U.S. Army elements moving north of a line that stretches from Najaf in the in the west, all the way down the Euphrates River over to Basra area, and the U.S. Army has now strongly sent a signal to Saddam Hussein that the Republican Guard units, the Fedayeen officers he sent to hold the Euphrates line, have failed to do so. The U.S. Army is rolling north now in the general direction of Baghdad, albeit in a very yellow sandstorm, but they have punched through Iraqi resistance.
Well, staying with the terrible problems that the weather's causing, the lead coalition convoy was hit by a fierce sandstorm when it was about 50 miles from Baghdad. David Bloom from the American television network NBC sent this report.
The reason why it's basically pitch black is not merely the darkness. The reason why I'm wearing these ski goggles is not merely the darkness. We've been in a sandstorm throughout this entire day, which is really bogging down these forces, making life miserable for them. It certainly affects the fighting power of this U.S. military in a couple ways. Number one, this is a tank brigade that I'm with, mostly tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles. And while the tanks and Bradleys can operate in this environment, their close air support, especially the American-made Apache helicopters, have a very difficult time, very dangerous. Their engines clog up. Frankly, they crash in this kind of weather, so they can't get the close air support that they need to make this assault on the Republican Guard, which they're anticipating making in the next couple days. Number two, it's very difficult on the equipment. Behind me, I don't even think you can necessarily see this anymore, but about 10 to 15 feet behind me, there are half a dozen American mechanics working on a Bradley engine, which is a vehicle that's just over there, and they're trying to get this engine repaired. But you can imagine that in this sandstorm, with the sand just whipping through and sticking and clogging up the engine, it makes the repair work that much more difficult.
As coalition troops advance on Baghdad, the southern port of Qasr is being prepared for the arrival of food aid. British officials have confirmed the only deep-water port in Iraq is now secure. And as Emily Morgan reports, Royal Marines have been sweeping the waterways for mines, delaying the humanitarian aid by several days.
There's desert, there's heat, there's dust. And this doesn't help either. Human minesweepers are trying to prepare Qasr port for tens of thousands of tons of food aid. They're waiting on ships far out in the Gulf. For the Australian frogmen, getting wet is the least of their worries. Beneath the fast-flowing cocktail of sewage, mud and crude oil, visibility's only arm's length, and mines could be anywhere.
All you can see in the distance is a dark object, so you have to swim up on it and then basically use your hands to work out what it is.
They haven't found any booby traps so far, only 4 sea mines on a sunken boat. Troops claim Qasr's now secure, but they also say the sound of gunfire's been keeping them awake at night. The British Marines drove journalists to Qasr to prove that their campaign's not all about bombs and bullets.
It's a huge port. It can take a huge volume of ships, and what we hope to do is to get those ships in good order so that we can get this humanitarian supplies ashore, onto trucks and out to the people who so desperately need it.
But this is only a snapshot. People have been putting to sea from here for as long as there have been ships. Iraq's other big port, Basra, looks straight across its waterway to its longtime adversary, Iran. And the path to the sea from here runs under the lee of Kuwaiti territory. It's resulted in decades of friction and clashes. This port was wrecked in 2 wars, the Iran-Iraq War and Desert Storm, but the British say it's remained in good shape. Until the threat of war closed it, Qasr brought in 2/3 of food that fed 2/3 of the Iraqis. 1 berth's ready, and the Marines won't be waiting for the rest to be cleared before turning on a promised torrent of supplies. Emily Morgan, ITV News.
Concern is now growing in Washington that Iraq may defend Baghdad with chemical weapons. There's concern too about the rising number of casualties and prisoners of war. Here's Robert Moore.
The armoured thrust has taken the US military deep into central Iraq. The lead elements are now just 50 miles south of the capital. But with every mile gained comes an additional fear that at some point Saddam's most loyal troops will use chemical weapons.
Gas, gas, gas! Gas, gas, gas!
So far there have only been false alarms, but the Pentagon has received intelligence that the regime's strongholds of Baghdad and Tikrit will be defended with chemical or biological weapons.
There has been intelligence scraps, who knows how accurate they are, chatter in the system that suggests that the closer that coalition forces get to Baghdad and Tikrit, the greater the likelihood.
Iraq has fired artillery shells filled with chemical weapons many times, especially in the late 1980s against Iranian forces. And now Saddam Hussein appears to have nothing to lose. It is the greatest imponderable of the next few days, as the prize of Baghdad comes into the sights of US ground troops. President Bush has been trying to steel the nerves of the nation, saying victory is assured, whatever is thrown at American forces.
We're fighting them with bravery and courage. We cannot know the duration of this war, yet we know its outcome. We will prevail.
But increasingly visible is the heartbreaking sight of officers arriving at homes to announce a death in battle. Lance Corporal Jose Gutierrez, an immigrant serving in the Marines, was the second American soldier to die.
I miss Jose. He is the best brother in the world. He fought for the USA. He died for the United States.
His story is just one tragedy flowing from the war. A Guatemalan fighting for America, dying on a battlefield in southern Iraq. And the Commander-in-Chief knows the most dangerous battles almost certainly lie ahead. Robert Moore, ITV News, Washington.
Well, some special forces of a different kind joined the war on Iraq today. Bottlenose dolphins are scouring the waters of the port of Qasr for Iraqi mines. They've been specially trained to use their natural sonar to locate the mines and then mark them with floats. Well, joined by Michael McGinty in the studio. Michael, quite incredible what they can train the animals to do.
Well, it is amazing, and what's unusual about this is that they have an operational role. Most animals in warfare, like horses, are used to drag things around or for cavalry or something. Dogs have been used to sniff out casualties under collapsed buildings and so on. But this is quite unusual, and it started off in the Cold War, this idea of using them to sniff out mines, and there were even suggestions that they could strap explosives to the dolphins, and they'd go into harbours, find ships, and then something they would do, which in training had given them a reward, would detonate the explosives. So that was a bit nasty. But they're highly intelligent creatures. I'm not sure how exactly you communicate with a marine mammal to train it to this level. But it is in many ways a very unusual use of animals, and a very benign one too.
It obviously works. Absolutely incredible. Amazing. Well, that's it from me and Lucas. We'll be here at 5 o'clock. Iraqi civilians have staged an uprising on the streets of Basra in the first signs that the tide may be turning against Saddam Hussein. The rebellion is the development the US government had been hoping for, but the humanitarian situation there is causing mounting concern. With the first of two reports from NBC television in the United States, here's Jim Miklaszewski.
For civilians trapped in Basra, an already dangerous situation grew even more desperate today. Iraqi troops reportedly fired mortars at a group of civilians who had apparently attempted an uprising against Saddam Hussein. The U.S. military had hoped to bypass Basra on the way to Baghdad, but now may be forced to engage Iraqi militia dug into the city.
Our intent is to return security to the city as rapidly as we can and root out those forces that would fight in the city.
But as U.S. forces fight a raging sandstorm today, there are more serious concerns that under the current U.S. war plan, there may not be enough American ground troops to win the war safely. The Army's 3rd Infantry, along with U.S. Marines, are advancing on the Republican Guard's Medina Division near Karbala. But both units have come under almost constant attack along the way. Hit-and-run guerrilla-style attacks, taking an unknown number of casualties, dead and wounded. So the military is now rushing the 101st Airborne up behind them to protect their flank. The U.S. plan puts 1 U.S. Armored Division up against 5 divisions of Republican Guards and 15,000 armed security forces inside Baghdad. Retired Gulf War veteran General Barry McCaffrey says the Americans will prevail. But without more ground troops, it puts American soldiers at greater risk.
We have no business taking on that mission unless we're prepared to decisively employ combat power.
Defense Secretary Rumsfeld today bristled at any criticism.
And it is a good plan. It is a plan that in 4.5 or 5 days has moved ground forces to within a short distance of Baghdad.
Whatever the plan, the major ground war against the Republican Guard is about to begin.
As British Marines battle for control of Basra, the city is on the verge of a humanitarian crisis. Fresh water is in critically short supply in southern Iraq. Taps and power cut off since fighting began here last Friday. The Red Cross says much more help is needed. Key to that effort, the nearby port of Qasr. By air and sea, coalition forces are sweeping for mines, and today specially trained Dolphins arrived to join the effort.
We have recovered ships, tugboats and barges down at the mouth of KA that had very many mines on them ready to be deployed.
The coalition needs this port to bring in food and humanitarian supplies still waiting in ships offshore. They had hoped to have it open already, but making this area safe is taking longer than expected.
One of the things that a lot of us expected was to be able to come in here in a relatively quick manner. There has been continued resistance.
So before bringing supplies into Qasr, British Marines today brought in 2 truckloads of media to see firsthand the mines recovered from Iraqi boats and the difficulty keeping this area secure. After intense fighting in the village of Qasr throughout the weekend, today sniper fire was still a serious threat at the port.
Just take a look out there. There's a million places snipers can hide, or a million places they can put booby traps to slow us down.
Still, getting help to the people of southern Iraq is a top priority. The Navy says tomorrow the port will finally be safe. Even from the back of a military truck, it's clear the help is badly needed. Don Teague, NBC News, Qasr, Iraq.
It's 5 o'clock. This is the ITV News channel on ITV1, bringing you the latest developments on Operation Iraqi Freedom. During the night, up to 40 large blasts have rocked the Iraqi capital, Baghdad. The attacks lasted about 2 hours. Strategic government buildings and Republican Guard positions were targeted. They believed to be dug in on the southern flank of the city to defend it against invading US and British forces. The skyline was lit up with buildings that were on fire. This was the scene a few hours ago. Iraqi TV was also targeted and is now off the air. US officials wanted to end the stream of propaganda it had been broadcasting since the attacks started. And this is the scene in Baghdad this morning. The air thick with smoke from burning buildings. And before the attacks, of course, there were very strong sandstorms in the desert which were also affecting visibility. But as we can see there, something is obscuring visibility across the city. It could well be smoke from the burning buildings after those attacks during the night. And this is live from RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire. Just after 3:30 this morning, a giant B-52 bomber took off from the airbase, headed, we assume, for Iraq. Emma Murphy with a full roundup of events so far.
Shattering the silence of the darkened morning sky came another wave of warplanes to dispatch their deadly cargo on Baghdad. Within minutes, the city's skyline provided evidence of one of the most intense bombing raids to date. Smoke plumes billowing across the horizon, flames shooting up close to the Information Ministry and the Iraqi state-run television headquarters. They were broadcasting at the time. The strikes took them off air. Around 30 explosions were counted to the south of the city as coalition forces sought to once again destroy key strongholds of Saddam's regime and the Republican Guard. And as if to prove there was yet more to come, Another wave of B-52s had left RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire before the dust had time to settle in Baghdad. Meanwhile, the ground war continues apace, slowed only by the choking dust storms which have blown up over the last 24 hours. 60 miles south of Baghdad, the US Army's 3rd Infantry's march onto the capital was halted by the storms and howling winds. Visibility was just 5 meters.
It's hard visibility for the driver and the BC to work together, and it's hard for me to see too. It's hard, all this dust, it just gets everything in your eyes.
Sand gets in your eyes, it's hard to breathe, you know, and we're pushing through it.
They are now waiting for resupply and reinforcements ahead of the battle, which both sides accept will be decisive.
We've put helicopters against them, attack helicopters. We've put air against them. We've put some artillery against them, but we haven't engaged them in a classic battle. So their mettle has yet to be tested. We're going to have to find out.
The air bombardment, desert storms and smoke from oil fires have left Baghdad itself shrouded in a murky gloom. However, there's no hiding the impact of the air bombardment. The barrage appears to be claiming civilian lives. Amid grief and anger, 3 coffins draped with the Iraqi flag were carried through the streets. But Iraqi ministers deny the assault is weakening Saddam's grip on power.
Saddam Hussein is in full control of his country. He is in full control of his armed forces.
Despite the onslaught, Baghdad is not yet under siege. People here are still well supplied with food. However, time is running out, and with every bombing raid, the ability of the city and its people to function normally reduces. Emma Murphy, ITV News.
Those are the latest developments so far. Of course, we'll be getting updates from all our correspondents in Iraq and America during the next hour. Well, Tony Blair will travel to the United States today. He's due to spend the evening at Camp David with President Bush, then fly to New York, where he will meet United Nations Secretary-General Kofi Annan, as Owen Thomas reports.
President Bush and the Prime Minister, friends, allies, determined to show the world that they're as united in their cause as they were in the Azores Summit to defeat Saddam Hussein. This new meeting will give them the chance to discuss how the current conflict is going and whether their strategy is working. And earlier, the PM had this message to the Iraqi people.
But this time we will not let you down. Saddam and his regime will be removed. Iraq will have a better future ahead of it.
This is a key question for Mr. Blair. Just what will happen to Iraq after this conflict? What about the refugees? Who will govern it on an interim basis? What role will the UN have in providing security? And that's where things differ between Washington and London. But at the moment, at least, in public, George Bush remains focused on the military campaign.
We cannot know the duration of this war, yet we know its outcome. We will prevail. The Iraqi regime will be disarmed. The Iraqi regime will be ended. The Iraqi people will be free. And our world will be more secure.
Tony Blair believes the UN must have a big role in a post-war Iraq, and he's going to be meeting the Secretary-General Kofi Annan on this trip. He also needs to patch up relationships with his European partners. George Bush appears not to be quite so distracted. Owen Thomas, ITV News.
Well, Owen Thomas is at Downing Street this morning with the latest from number 10. Owen.
Well, Anne, obviously Tony Blair is going to be going off to Camp David to talk about the war and also some of the setbacks that have been taking place over the past few days, and also looking ahead to some of the bloody battles that will be going on. Also, I think it's important on a personal level for Tony Blair to go over and meet his ally, his really only ally, George Bush, face to face. He's really been ploughing a very lonely furrow over the past few weeks. But there's a third important point, Anne, you know. There is not a whisker of difference between Tony Blair and George Bush as to the war, its aims, its outcome. Where there is a difference is to what happens to Iraq post-Saddam. Now, Tony Blair is desperate that the United Nations has an absolutely imperative, important role in rebuilding the country, in coordinating the interim government, being the police force there, As for the Americans, well, they're not so sure. They don't have a great deal of faith in the United Nations after the events of the past few days, and they want to see much more of an American-backed policing post-Saddam, and that's where the difference is, and that's where the tension is between Washington and London.
And of course, Tony Blair is also meeting Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations. Obviously, those are going to be quite intense talks too.
Indeed. Tony Blair is acutely aware of the damage that's been done to the reputation of the United Nations. Remember, it just seems such a long time ago now, doesn't it? But it was only a little more than a week that there was all that toing and froing, the diplomatic bargaining going on at the Security Council, trying to get that second resolution through the Security Council. Well, of course, in the end, it just didn't happen. America and Britain just went their own way, and that's caused immense damage between the United Nations and also against Britain and America. But there's also a great deal of repair and damage done between relations between Europe and Britain. We've just lost our lighting. I hope you can still see me. But as France and Germany said in their conference just last week, you know, they really want to see a UN backed administration once Saddam has gone. Back to you in the light there.
Thank you very much indeed, Owen. We did hear your words, even though we lost your face there. Throughout the rest of Iraq, there has been extensive fighting between coalition forces and regular as well as irregular elements of the Iraqi army. Pentagon sources are claiming that in one battle alone, up to 300 Iraqi soldiers were killed. And in Basra in southern Iraq, it's believed there are the beginnings of a popular uprising against forces loyal to Saddam Hussein. Harry Fawcett reports.
Over Basra, a storm was breaking overnight. The question was what was happening in the town itself. British soldiers on the outskirts hoping that a full-scale uprising was underway. British intelligence reports suggested the picture in Iraq's second city had changed considerably from just a couple of days ago, when the streets were filled with anti-coalition demonstrators and its inhabitants were now engaged in an uprising against Saddam's forces and were coming under heavy attack. The British 7th Armoured Brigade had been firing on the outskirts of the city all day, but there's still no sign of an advance. British commanders say they don't want to do anything hot-headed. The US Defense Secretary admitted that it left anti-Saddam elements inside Basra in a vulnerable position.
People will rise up. But let there be no doubt, these are a repressed people. But I hope and pray they'll do it at a time when there are sufficient forces nearby to be helpful to them, rather than in a time where it simply costs their life and it's a wasted life.
It's also been confirmed that 2 British soldiers were killed in earlier fighting around Basra. Corporal Stephen Albert, 35, from Stoke-on-Trent, and 19-year-old trooper David Clark from Staffordshire were killed when their Challenger tank came under fire from another British tank. 2 other soldiers were seriously injured. It was a high price for what was otherwise a comprehensive victory, in which British helicopter gunships played a major role.
A second tank then came and engaged us, but fortunately we managed to engage him before he got effective fire on us and destroyed that tank too.
Was his barrel swinging around towards you?
It was, which concentrates the mind somewhat.
Further north, what's reported to have been the biggest ground battle of the war so far took place near the city of Najaf. It's thought Iraqi soldiers, either regular or paramilitary, and on foot, attacked the massed ranks of the United States 7th Cavalry. They fired rocket-propelled grenades and came under heavy fire as a result. The Pentagon says up to 300 Iraqis were killed in the confrontation. There are no reports yet of American casualties. Despite this apparent reverse, the Iraqi information minister appeared on television to read a statement from Saddam Hussein himself, appealing for tribesmen to rise up against the invading forces across the country. There was little sign of his word being heeded, though, in Qasr, where British Marines have been receiving a warm welcome and doling out rations and water. The question now is whether, and at what price, similar scenes will be played out in Basra and Baghdad. Harry Fawcett, ITV News.
Well, joining me live now is Michael McGinty from the Royal United Services Institute. Michael, a few developments overnight to discuss, and we've seen a B-52 bomber take off this morning from RAF Fairford. What does that imply to you?
Well, many things. I think the targeting of these aircraft can be very varied, but we've also heard, of course, that we're now within 50 miles of Baghdad. We've heard that the armoured spearhead is resting to get the troops rested. They're letting the logistics tail catch up with them. They're bringing in fuel, water, food. which suggests they're getting ready for something pretty big, and there's artillery fire as well.
This bomber that we're seeing taking off here would obviously be a key part in that, you'd imagine.
It most certainly would. Now, what we saw in Afghanistan with this aircraft was quite a new role for it. It's a very large aircraft. It started life in the early 50s to supply the airborne alert force, and these 744 B-52s would always keep some within 2 hours flying time of their targets in Russia, which they would go and nuke if they absolutely had to. Of course, happily they never did. They then took on a cruise missile role, an anti-shipping role, but now there's this close battlefield support role, and I wouldn't be surprised if what we're seeing is these aircraft taking off either to carpet bomb the Republican Guards outside Baghdad or to strike very precisely at their hardware, their tank concentrations, their artillery and so on. And there will also be helicopter gunship attacks as well to defeat forces in detail and take out smaller targets or even down to single trenches. But the B-52s will have a crucial role in this, and in fact the role they have is a stunning role. The shock and awe we heard so much about is really something that was supposed to be aimed at the whole population, but actually when it happened looked, to my mind, a little bit limp. But against troops, to have this rain of a high explosive coming down on you can be very stunning and very disorientating. And so what we've seen taking off so far, I suspect, is going to be part of the softening up in Baghdad.
Well, indeed, and overnight there have been developments with something like 30 explosions across the city. Do you think this is an escalation?
Well, I think it is. I think it's important, interesting to look at the potential target set. There was one in the centre of Baghdad. There were several around the southern outskirts, apparently very large explosions, which would suggest either something like daisy cutter bombs to take out troops on the ground, or more likely to be the bunker busters and the deep penetrating bombs to take out underground command centres and communication centres and to destroy the infrastructure which will be vital to the defence of Baghdad.
Well, indeed, there's also been speculation that they were taking out the Iraqi television station as well.
Indeed, and if you look back at Kosovo, we were quite keen then to take out television because this is the means by which governments can broadcast to their people, obviously. Now, in that case, because of the civilian casualties involved, we stopped doing it quite early on. But there are concerns because Saddam has now reappeared after all the speculation. He's alive, he looks pretty well, he's confident, he's saying all the right things, and that's something that we wish to scotch, because remember, a crucial part of this campaign is to get the Iraqis to rise up and to do the job themselves to some extent. So we need to knock out that channel of communication to the people.
And the B-52 bomber that we saw taking off earlier this morning will probably be over Iraq within about 4 hours from now, so that may herald the next development, do you think?
I think it may well do. I think we can see expect to see the final push towards Baghdad in the next 36 hours or so.
Thank you very much indeed, Michael McGinty from the Royal United Services Institute. Now then, let's take a look at your morning newspapers with Rachel McTavish in the newsroom. Rachel, what are the main stories so far?
Good morning, thanks very much, Anne. Well, let's start off with the Daily Telegraph, all the papers, as you'd expect, leading on the war in Iraq. They've got this incredible photograph on the front of the Daily Telegraph of an Iraqi tank that lies broken in the desert outside Basra yesterday after that day of fierce exchanges. Moving on to the Times, a lovely photo actually on the front of the Times, saying Marines are making friends with bars of chocolate. Royal Marine Roger Green there from Taunton hands out sweets to Iraqi children as the British troops continue to secure the port, the strategic port of Qasr. And the headline there, the rebels rise against Saddam. Moving on to the Daily Mail, once again that lovely picture on the front there, and the headline there, Liberators. But at the same time, we've got the sad stories coming through, the stories of those who've died trying to bring freedom to the Iraqis, and some of the coalition forces who've died there along the top of the front page. And in a similar vein, the Daily Express leads on one particular true hero, they say. They say that Philip died for his Queen and country there, and an interview with the widow of Royal Marine Captain Philip Guy, who was killed in action. Moving on to the anti-war paper, the Daily Mirror, and they have this incredible picture of, as we know, the sandstorms have really whipped up inside Baghdad, and this orange haze, this sinister orange haze, in a lot of the photos in the papers today, and just make out that eerie shadow of Saddam Hussein, the statue just there on the front page. And finally, ending on a slightly lighter note, the story we've been covering this morning, those incredible dolphins who've been helping out, trying to detect mines in the sea in the Gulf region. And you can see that the little sonar radar machine clipped onto the fin of the dolphin. Quite incredible story. Back to you, Anne.
Thanks, Rachel. Truly unexpected members of the coalition forces there. That was Rachel McTavish having a look at this morning's newspapers. Well, NBC's David Schuster is at Central Command in Doha in Qatar for us this morning. David, what can you tell us that you've learnt at that side?
Well, Anne, here at Central Command, officials are saying that it was just about 4 hours ago when the coalition launched a cruise missile and also some precision-guided bombs that took out the Iraqi television station in Baghdad.